Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, ICMDA, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from around the world in over 100 national associations. So it's a pleasure to have back Dr. Andy Bannister on the subject of digital evangelism, effectively using digital media for the gospel. And today's public square is, of course, largely a digital one. We're in digital space now, and it's vital that Christians and ministries and churches think creatively and clearly about how to engage the world of media, social media, and other digital spaces. Andy Bannister, who is the director of Solus, which is a UK-based evangelism ministry specializing in digital content creation, is going to help us to explore how we engage hearts and minds and souls through the digital realm. Some of the questions: how can we create content that will be widely read and shared? Does some things work better than digital spaces and others less effectively? What are the positives and the negatives of digital spaces? Does digital evangelism need huge budgets, or can one do it with a little? We explore all this and more in this talk. Andy Bannister is well known to ICMDA webinar listeners. We've had him several times before. He's the director of Solus Centre for Public Christianity, speaking and teaching regularly through the UK, Europe, Canada, the USA, and the wider world, and based up in Scotland. And he's broadcasting from Perth in Scotland today. That's the first Perth, not the Australian Perth. And from universities to churches, business forums to TV and radio, Andy regularly addresses audiences of both Christians and those of all faiths and none on issues relating to faith, culture, politics, and society. Andy, it's great to have you back on ICMDA webinars. We really look forward to hearing what you have to say and to engaging with you. Thank you, brother. Over to you.
You're welcome, Peter. Thank you for that introduction. Great to be back, I think, for my third ICMDA webinar, and looking forward to diving into this topic with you today. Thinking about, as Peter said in that introduction, how in terms of digital evangelism, how we can effectively use digital media for the gospel. As Pete said in that introduction, I work for Solus, head up Solus. A ministry really focusing on two things, and both of these, we do a lot of stuff in the digital space. Firstly, we are primarily an evangelistic ministry. We're really concerned with taking the gospel beyond the four walls of the church and into the public square. We do events in cafes and pubs and universities and schools, and the list goes on. But that public square is, of course, increasingly digital. And then secondly, we do a lot of work helping Christians think about how they can share their faith in Jesus with their friends and their neighbors and their colleagues. And again, a lot of that sharing now goes on in the digital space. And you can find out more about what we do, and by the way, get hold of loads of resources, digital resources, to help you reach your friends if you go to the Solus website. There's the URL for you on the screen. But introductions aside, let's dive into the topic. I want to do a bit of sort of scene setting about where we are digitally. We're going to think about some perhaps the challenges that the digital world brings, some of the opportunities, and I'm going to share some lessons we've learned at Solus, some ideas for best practice, all kinds of ideas I'm going to throw in there. And then, as Peter said, we'll have some Q&A. So if I don't talk about the thing you were hoping I would talk about, then we will have questions at the end. But to set the scene on where we are in terms of things digital, one fine spring morning in 1746, the French clergyman Jean-Antoine Nollet gathered 200 monks together. He had them stand in a line a mile long, and each monk was connected to his neighbour by a length of copper wire. Nollet then connected a primitive battery to the end of the line, instantly causing each monk to shriek and jump in the air as the electric shock went through all 200 of them. Now, Nollet was not some monastic masochist. Rather, he was conducting, pardon the terrible pun, he was conducting a very important experiment. He wanted to see how far electricity could be transmitted. He and other sort of early tinkerers with science, they believed that electricity held the key to building a long-distance communication network. And the work of him and other pioneers, that led to the invention of the electric telegraph, which really turned the world upside down. Because until that point, information could only travel at the speed of a train, a ship, or a horse. Those were the fastest ways to send information. And the telegraph revolutionized the world. In fact, you might say the telegraph helped make the modern world. And that historical lesson is a reminder for where we are today, because changes in technology, especially changes in communication technology, they change culture. And just as the printing press, the telegraph, and radio and TV beforehand, so the internet and digital technology have changed our world, and they've changed our world at lightning speed. We are now more connected than ever. The average person spends a third of their waking time on their phone, with an average, by the way, across the Western world at least, of 3 hours spent on social media. Media is now consumed increasingly digitally. Look at the way that technology, streaming platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime have replaced traditional TV, have replaced even cinema in many parts of the world. Interesting fact for you, the most expensive TV show of all time was not in fact a TV show, but was a streaming show. Amazon's Rings of Power, that comes in at $60 million an episode. Or think about news, for example. Almost nobody reads a newspaper or magazine in print these days. Rather, we consume our news digitally in a 24/7 news cycle, and that's changed so many things. And then I think there's the fact that so many of the big ethical questions of our age are related to technology, especially they're related to digital technology. Look at all the excitement around artificial intelligence with technologies like ChatGPT. And people are asking questions like, will artificial intelligence, will it put people out of jobs? Will workers no longer be needed? Will AI take over the world? And all of that rapid change means that the public square is now a digital public square. And this has huge implications for all sorts of things. Not least, it has implications for evangelism. How do we communicate the gospel of Jesus in the world that we now find ourselves, this digital world? Well, let's begin digging into that a bit by starting by thinking about some of the challenges, because the digital world that we're in brings some challenges with it. And the first challenge, I think, is a pretty obvious one. It's the challenge of busyness, is perhaps the first thing we need to be aware of. Technology is often marketed as labor saving. So many devices and gadgets, when they were invented, were told they will save time, but the reality is that they often don't. And this is true of digital technology. Most of us and our colleagues, we are surrounded by a barrage of notifications, beeps, tweets, emails, messages. There is so much digital noise and so many demands on people's time that it's hard to keep up. A few years ago now, the sociologist and of technology, Sherry Turkle, from MIT in the States, wrote a hugely influential book called Alone Together: Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. And that book looks about a lot of the implications of technology. And there's a story in there that really struck me, I think, in terms of the busyness that so many of our friends are dealing with. She tells this story of an interviewee that she spoke to for her research. Sherry describes this encounter. She said, Diane, 36, is a curator at a large Midwestern museum in the USA, and she's struggling to keep up with her technology. She says, I suppose I do my job better, but my job is my whole life, or my whole life is my job. When I move from calendar to book to email to text messages, I feel like a master of the universe. Everything is so efficient. I am a maximizing machine. I'm on my smartphone until 2 a.m. I don't sleep well, but I still can't keep up with what is sent to me. Now for work, I'm expected to have a Twitter feed and a Facebook presence about the museum. Well, my boss has asked me to start a blog on museum happenings, and that means me in all of these places. I have a voice condition. I keep losing my voice. It's not from talking too much. All I do is type, but it's hit me in my voice. My doctor tells me that it's a nervous thing. When I read that story, I was deeply moved, and her book is full of sort of encounters like that. And it makes me wonder if one challenge of evangelism in the digital world is the challenge of helping people see how Jesus' message of come to me, all of you who are heavy laden, is especially relevant to those who are looking for rest from endless digital demands on their attention. So that's the first challenge. Second challenge, after busyness, I think I would say distraction is a big one. Life for so many people, so many of us these days, we spend our lives, don't we, saturated with emails, texts, tweets, alerts, comments, links, posts, photos, videos, blogs, searches, downloads, uploads, files, folders, feeds, filters, walls, widgets, clouds, pop-ups, the list goes on. But of course, one of the interesting questions I think we can be asking our friends is, what happens when you try and pause from all that noise and stop and reflect? And the journalist William Powers wrote a wonderful little book a few years ago called Hamlet's Blackberry, Building a Good Life in the Digital Age. And he's not a Christian, but on page 10, there was this really Christian insight that he made that I think is, again, also worth us reflecting on. He wrote, when you start wondering about your own busyness, pretty soon you're pondering much deeper questions, such as, is this the kind of life I really want? From there, it's just a short hop to the big league existential stumpers. Why are we here? And who am I? Now, that's a question for our non-Christian friends and colleagues. Also a question for us, right? Because over the years, I think over the centuries, the church has shown a tendency sometimes to fall into opposite errors when it comes to culture and technology. We can be tempted to ignore technology and put our fingers in our ears and keep our doors shut and ignore them. But on the other hand, we can embrace them so quickly and uncritically that we don't perhaps stop and reflect theologically and biblically about how we're using these technologies. And one question I often like to ask folks, and ask myself really, is our use of digital technology, does it look different to the world's? As a Christian, does our use of digital technology look different to our non-Christian friends? I think that's an important question for all of us to reflect on. So 2 challenges: busyness, distraction. Third challenge, I think, is disconnection. The problem with all this digital noise that's going on in our culture right now is I think many people have forgotten how to have deep conversations, not just about things like faith and religion and spirituality and God, but much deeper conversations too. Our culture is really struggling, I think. Many people are struggling how to connect person to person. Here is our friend Sherry Turkle. Again, her follow-up book to Alone Together was another wonderful book called Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. Let me give you just a little flavor of that. She says early on in the book, she writes, we say that we turn to our phones when we're bored. And we often find ourselves bored because we have become accustomed to a constant feed of connection, information, and entertainment. There is now a word in the dictionary called phubbing. It means maintaining eye contact whilst texting. My students tell me they do it all the time, and it's not that hard. All of this adds up to a flight from conversation, at least conversation that's spontaneous, open-ended, conversation which we play with ideas, which we allow ourselves to be fully present and vulnerable. And there's a real challenge in here for us as Christians, I think, in that given that the gospel is not a set of ideas, and what we want to communicate to people is not so much an idea or a meme or a concept, but a person, Jesus Christ, we need to think quite hard, I think, about how we engage a world where more and more of our friends and colleagues are struggling with the idea of connection. And I wonder too if there's actually a real opportunity here for Christians and the church actually to speak into that and model what good communication looks like, not rejecting the digital world, but not sinking into it either. And then the fourth challenge, while we remain on challenges, a couple more for you: busyness, distraction, disconnection. Fourth challenge of the digital world is that everyone has their own truth and are their own experts. For any of you on this call who are wired, apologetically or theologically, that probably means you like arguments. You like persuading people. You get excited about the fact that Christianity is something you can give reasons for. Well, the problem is we now live in a world where 1,001 questions or objections to Christianity or anything are just a Google away, and everybody has their own truth. A couple of years ago, in fact, when Prince Harry, that former member of the British royal family, and Meghan Markle, his celebrity wife, they were interviewed on the Oprah Winfrey Show in the USA, and there was a moment that went viral on social media when Meghan Markle, in that interview, referred to my truth. And lots of Christians got very excited on social media and picked her up on this and said, well, hang on a minute, isn't truth universal? But of course, that is true, but you'd be amazed how many people, especially online, don't think this. And one reason for that, I think, and that we struggle with this slippery concept of truth in today's world, is that whatever you believe, there is a Facebook group for you. In fact, literally last night, I was doing a training event face-to-face for a church in Glasgow. When someone asked me, they said, I'm trying to share my faith with a friend who is a committed flat earther. Everything for him is about the world is flat. He's on a Facebook group with hundreds of others, and he's in this little bubble. How do I reach him? That's the kind of world we're living in. Everyone has their own truth, and they can find people like them. It's hard to communicate in that kind of world. And that leads to our fifth and final challenge, and then I'm going to talk about the opportunities. Digital flocking is the last thing I want to just raise to our attention for a moment. What is digital flocking? Well, that's a term that sociologists have coined for the way that online people tend to hang out with people just like them and ignore or denigrate others. For example, there's been research shown that during election campaigns, we had an election here in the UK back in the summer, during elections now, what happens is the majority of people online on social media only read or reshare material favourable to their candidate or their party, and they spend their time being very, very rude about people who believe differently to them. And what we're seeing is that politics and other discussions is happening more and more and more in echo chambers online. And that's a massive challenge and a danger too, actually, by the way, especially for Christians. If we're not careful, we can spend all of our time online just hanging out with fellow Christians. We only read material that supports what we believe. It's very easy to start speaking badly of others who disagree with us, and so on and so on. And then what happens is you have the Christian echo chamber, and we never reach our non-Christian friends who are living over here in a bubble of their own. And by the way, I mentioned 5 challenges. I'd forgotten. I've got one more for you, bonus one, before we look at the opportunities. 6th final challenge for you, shrillness and lack of nuance. This probably doesn't really need saying, does it? Twitter, or X as we now call it, is not a forum known for its subtlety. There is a lot of shouting online, and sadly, Christians, we are not always immune from this either. It can be very easy to reduce what our opponents think to sound bites, or we can caricature them, especially when we're talking about people who are engaging online. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, the psychologist Jonathan Haidt offers a really helpful metaphor. He talks about a rider and an elephant to explain how we make our judgments as human beings. He says, we like to think that we're making our judgments by careful reason, but most of the time, a lot of the judgments we make are actually instinctive. The rider of reason, as he puts it, is sitting on top of the elephant of intuition. And most of the time, the elephant will go wherever it wants to go. The rider has a bit of influence, but a lot of the time, the elephant will charge wherever it sees fit. And when I read that, I thought that is a beautiful description of what goes on online most of the time. Online, particularly on social media, there are lots of elephants trumpeting at each other. And as Christians, we can sometimes naively assume that if we just post a sensible comment or a clever argument into an online forum, that will see some fruit. But the danger is we're appealing to the rider and not the elephant, and we sometimes don't get the results we would like to see. So just some thoughts for you in terms of challenges. Let me now turn to opportunities, because I'm an optimist, not a pessimist. I think there are huge opportunities online whilst being aware where we're starting from, and huge opportunities out there. And by the way, one of the things that really encourages me when it comes to the digital world is when it comes to technology, history is on our side. Christians have always embraced new technology, especially communications technology. For example, it was Christians who were early adopters of the codex, the early form of the book that replaced the scroll. And one of the reasons that the scroll fell out of use and the book took over is Christians discovered this was a wonderful medium for distributing the Gospels in the first few centuries. Scroll forward 1500 years, and it was Christians who quickly adopted the printing press. Think of Gutenberg's Bible, forever associated there with the printing press. And the same is true with the telegraph and radio and TV, due time the internet. Christians and the church have always been really good, I think, at getting hold of new forms of technology and figuring out how we can use those to spread the good news of Jesus, because there are great opportunities here despite the challenges. And one of the biggest opportunities right at the get-go I would want to raise, of course, is the fact that the digital public square gives you the opportunity of engaging those who never come to your church or who never come to a Christian meeting. We've seen this at Solas, where a few years ago now, we launched what we call the Short Answers video series. On the Solas website, you can find these. There are about 200 free videos, about 4 or 5 minutes long, each addressing a common question about the Christian faith. We have had millions of downloads on that video series, and we know from the responses and the follow-through that huge amounts of those are being found by people who don't have any kind of Christian faith. They wouldn't necessarily come to a church, but they are engaging with Christian content online. The other thing that the digital world allows you to do too is for your message to go global, or at least wider than just your immediate community. Unprecedented opportunity to reach people more easily and more cheaply. And sometimes that happens in unexpected ways. I was talking a few months ago to a friend of mine who's a pastor here in Scotland, and he had this astonishing email out of the blue landed in his inbox from a man in Australia who had come to faith through a sermon that my friend had preached. My friend had preached his sermon. It had been streamed on YouTube. Someone in Australia had seen it, had shared it with a friend who had shared it with another friend, and eventually the skeptical man had seen it, and God had used it to convict him, and he came to faith in Christ, and later, tracked down the pastor in Scotland and emailed him and thanked him. My friend Alistair said, I had no idea when I was standing in Inverness on that Sunday that the sermon I preached would be used by God to lead someone to faith in Christ, 6 months later in Melbourne. That is the digital world at its best in terms of what can happen. And then I think the other opportunity that the digital world, of course, brings is it gives you the opportunity to directly engage with an audience. People can post a comment on social media. They can post a comment on a YouTube video. They can engage with stuff that you share online, and you can then engage and respond with them. Now, sometimes what you get if you put content out online is you get foolishness and, stupidity and abuse, but you also get an awful lot of honest seekers, people who are looking to think about spiritual things. And over the years, I have had the joy and the thrill of engaging with people who've posted a comment on something I've shared or something Solas has shared. And, we've had some really good in-depth conversations and seen real fruit come from that. And again, real blessing that the digital tools bring that perhaps some of the older ways of communicating don't. So, challenges and opportunities. Let me now talk in my kind of last 10 or 12 minutes. I want to talk a little bit about some principles for personal digital evangelism, because you can do digital evangelism online as a church or a ministry. You can also do it personally. And I just want to share with you some tips and principles that I found, and then I'm going to give some principles for churches, because some of you on here may be in church leadership, involved in your churches or ministries, as well as doing the other work that you do. But let me start personally. Because all of us can engage in evangelism online personally. And here are some principles, 5 principles that I've found over the years to be really, really helpful. Most of them are obvious, but sometimes that which is obvious needs saying. So here's the first one. First one is that remember that real world communication, I think, is always better. This is not to knock the digital world. I love the digital world. I spend quite a fair amount of time in it. But I've found over the years that digital evangelism works best when it supports the real world. So, for example, if you're connected digitally with someone in your town or workplace, it's massively more productive to actually say, don't just keep your conversation on Facebook or Twitter, but to say, hey, this has been really interesting. Why don't we grab a coffee sometime when you've got a moment, to take the conversation from online to offline? We do a lot of this at Solas, by the way, when people engage with our content. If they're near us, we love to get to see people. If not, we will always try and connect people with a local church or somebody we know who can take a conversation further, because there's so much more that can be done face-to-face than digitally. So think about how the digital can support the offline. Secondly, try and extend your tribe, by which I mean, I talked about this earlier, don't just hang out online with Christians, but spend time with others, and you'll learn lots as well. I always think of Paul in Acts 17. He takes the time, if you remember that passage, to walk around Athens, to look at what's going on, to look at the city, to figure out what people believe. And we can do the same thing online. And then you can think about, well, how might I get my content or my message in front of people other than my tribe? That could be something as simple as, say, joining a Facebook group connected with a hobby or a sport. If you play soccer, or you're, there's a particular movie you like, or type of music you're into, or you're into rock climbing, whatever it is. What about going online and not just being part of a Christian group online? If you're something like a Facebook user, what about joining a group online connected with that hobby and interest? Because you'll get to meet non-Christians. Or if you're involved in church leadership, maybe it might be developing a social media strategy for your church that you help us think about using advertising to push your content beyond just Christians to those who are beyond the walls of the church. Lots of things to think about there, but think about, how do I reach beyond my tribe? Thirdly, be authentic. Not much to say here other than the fact that people can see through falsehood and bluster. So if you're a small church, for example, don't pretend to be a big church online. If you are a Christian with a small influence, don't try and big yourself up online and try and make out you're some incredible influencer and make grandiose claims. People will see through it instantly. Be yourself, whether you're a church or an individual. Be real, be who you are. People are drawn to authenticity, especially in this age where there's a lot of falsehood online. Fourthly, and my word, I think this is an important one, don't be weird. What do I mean by this? Well, in my humble opinion, the social media feeds of quite a lot of Christians I've encountered fall into one or two categories. Either we can be tempted to share nothing at all about our faith. So our social media feeds, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, we fill them up with pictures of our kids looking cute or some latest comedy meme that, let's be honest, everybody else already saw 3 years ago. Or we go the other way and we plaster our social media with insanely naff Christian content or Christian conspiracy theories, or worse, just conspiracy theories in general. And then our friends look at us and go, what on earth are you doing? I think there's a better way. I think a better way is to maintain a normal presence online, put pictures of your holiday and your family and what you're doing and the things you would normally share. But in that, drop into your social media feed online, just drop in good quality, thought-provoking Christian content. And as you do, ask yourself the question, what might my non-Christian friends and colleagues think if they saw this? Is it something that would engage them? Is it winsome? Is it persuasive? Is it helpful? Is it thoughtful? If you're stuck for ideas, take a look at the SOLAS website. Lots of other ministries do great stuff. We do some stuff, and we link to others who do good stuff too. But yeah, don't be weird. Fifthly, intrigue people. This is, I think, a really interesting one to think about online. What I mean by intriguing people is, as a non-Christian friend or colleague, as they surf online or scroll through endless social media posts, your non-Christian friend or colleague is probably not likely to click on a social media post entitled something like 5 reasons why atheism is stupid or why you need Jesus today. I mean, God can work through that kind of stuff. But what about thinking about, how could I post something that might intrigue people, that might make people think, that might start with the things they're already interested in and draw them gently in? Let me give you some examples of a few things we've tried at SOLAS that have helped in different ways over the years. We ran a series a couple of years ago called Have You Ever Wondered? That's a series of blogs and video content that you can share and reshare. And it takes topics like beauty and art and meaning and justice, things that everybody cares about, and gently asks, have you ever wondered why these things care to you, why you care about these things? And we bridge from there gently into the gospel. We've seen huge fruit from that approach, and actually we turned it into a book earlier this year called Have You Ever Wondered? And I'll put this link into the chat later as well. There's a link there to where you can get a free digital copy of that and check it out. If you like it, you can get a print copy to give to a friend. And we found that wandering approach, getting people thinking gently about spiritual questions, is a really powerful way online of sowing seeds for the gospel. We also found at SOLAS over the years, we ran a series last year called Undercurrents, where we wrote a series of blog articles around films that were current and films and media that people were into. We started with the films and the TV shows and the music that people were listening to, and tried to find ways of, again, making gospel connections. Because if you're a fan of, Rings of Power on Amazon, and you see something related to that scroll by on your Facebook feed, you're far more likely to click than you are with something that you think's got nothing to do with you. And then I mentioned a moment ago, short answers, enough said there, really. Well, In my last 3 or 4 minutes, let's begin thinking about drawing the threads together and giving you some principles this time for churches and ministries. I've talked about some ideas personally, about some things you might do, some principles, some ideas, some ways that you might engage online. But what about if you're involved in a church leadership? Perhaps perhaps you're an elder or a deacon or in some kind of leadership or actively involved in your church. How can churches and ministries do evangelism online in an engaging way? Well, here are some lessons again that I've learned personally over doing this for the last 15 or 16 years or so, and we've learned a little bit at SOLAS. First thing I would say, do less better so you can do more well. What do I mean by that? Well, I often come across churches and organizations trying to do way too much in terms of digital content, trying to produce huge amounts of stuff, spreading themselves thin, and producing and doing, therefore, quite a lot of quite ineffective content. So what about, rather than trying to do 5 things in an average way, you try to do one thing really well? Or if you've come across another church or ministry that's doing something very similar to what you want to do, rather than just duplicate it and reproduce, what about just share the content they've produced? Someone's already done the work for you. How about learning to use the good work of others well? Secondly, in your churches, figure out who has got a gift for digital stuff, especially young people. There is such a wonderful opportunity here for churches to bring young people into evangelistic ministry, because often the younger ones amongst us understand the digital world better. So, if I'm thinking about this myself at the moment, in that I feel increasingly challenged that I need to sort of get into and get engaged with TikTok. It's not a platform I've done much on, but I'm also at the same time thinking, would I be better spending that time coaching a young person and doing something in how to produce evangelistic content and then letting them play with that platform because they're going to understand it better than I am? What a wonderful way to release the gifts of those that God may have provided us in our churches. Thirdly, briefly experiment and iterate, adapt. I love digital evangelism. It's very easy to experiment and try things. If they work, repeat them. If they don't, move on. Do that online. Don't get stuck in a groove. Try things out, experiment, see what works as you pray over it and give it a go out there. Thirdly, learn from others. I've mentioned earlier this. What are other people doing well? What are our secular friends doing well with their content? And that's been an interesting one for me, watching what's the atheist community putting out. Have they got some clever ideas for engaging? What are my Muslim friends doing online? Other ideas and methods and approaches that we can see others doing that we could adapt, learn from others. Tackle the big questions. Look out for, what are the big cultural questions? What are the things that everyone's talking about? And maybe we should be talking about those too. If Christians and churches had more of a reputation, perhaps, for engaging with the tough questions of the day thoughtfully and winsomely, I think that would draw an awful lot of people in, actually. Good opportunity there. Finally, 3 more for you, and then we'll be done. Avoid the culture wars. Again, probably doesn't need saying, but then maybe it does need saying. Don't start fighting pointless battles online. You may think Donald Trump is a total genius. You may think Elon Musk is evil. You may think free speech is the most important thing in the world. That is all fine. But if you take those kind of culture war issues and you mix them in with the gospel, especially on social media, it gets very messy. Just think wisely about the other stuff that you're talking about, and don't bring Jesus into disrepute because of other topics that perhaps you're passionate about. Be available to those who comment. If people say things on your social media feeds when you posted Christian content, no matter what it is, try and find the time to engage. Even if some angry atheist has said something outrageously rude, there's no harm in just replying, hey, I disagree with you, but thanks for taking the time to watch and engage. You can really draw people in by taking the time to respond. Be generous. If another church or ministry sees your content and they like it and they say, hey, can we use what you've done there? Always say yes. We try and do this all the time at SOLAS. Usually our only request is please put a link back to us, but sure, take our content. We just want to see it get out the door. Take that attitude of generosity. And, as Paul talks about in the New Testament, he didn't care who was preaching the gospel and why they were preaching the gospel, as long as they were preaching the gospel. And then finally, final point for you, think about how we can be story-driven. The digital marketplace, the digital world thrives on stories. And those who have an issue with Christianity often use stories to make their case. And then often as Christians, what we do, along comes the evangelist or the apologist, and we try and respond to stories with facts. And the thing is, facts are great. I'm a philosopher. I love facts. But facts also lack a certain power. So try and find ways to tell stories. Tell stories of what God is doing in your lives, the lives of your friends, the life of your communities. Tell stories of who Jesus is. In fact, Jesus was the great storyteller. And in the stories he's left us in the Gospels, there are so many great resources, I think, that we can draw upon as we try and engage a story-driven age in the digital world. So, in conclusion, covered a lot of ground. Hope I've given you some food for thought there. We're going to send the slides around afterwards, so that will give you an opportunity to dig back over some of the stuff that I've done. But let me end, before I hand back to Pete to do some Q&A, let me end by just pointing out 3 resources in particular that you might find helpful. I've mentioned some as we've gone, but 3 resources. Do give the SOLAS website a check out. Lots of stuff there, both in terms of digital evangelistic tools and evangelism training. My friend Dan Strange, UK-based evangelist and theologian, wrote a brilliant book called Plugged In, Connecting Your Faith with What You Watch, Read and Play. If you're a reader, that might be worth trying to track down. You can get it in print or on ebook format for those of you in other countries. Really good book, I think, on how we can engage culture more widely. And then lastly, she's not a Christian. She's a kind of sort of liberal Jewish background, but Sherry Turkle's book, Alone Together. For those of you who really want to think through what are the big, perhaps pastoral issues, especially among young people and millennials, 25-year-olds and under, who are immersed in the digital world, and there are some big issues out there. Sherry's book, Alone Together, or I expect more from technology and less from each other, is amazing. And if you want to see her in action, if you Google her, followed by the words TED Talk, she did a great TED Talk on her material a few years ago that is well worth a watch. But that's enough from me. Pete, back to you, and we can do some Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. So, Andy, that was a phenomenal amount of stuff, really comprehensive. Great seeing the sweep of history. And I was particularly encouraged by your comment about how historically Christians have been right at the forefront of using new technology, and talked about codices and the printing press and so on. And then, of course, the challenge for us now with AI and all this new technology. And it's great to see what SOLAS is doing right at the cutting edge of this as well. So let's go to the questions. And first up, another author who's spoken on ICMDA webinars, Benjamin Chang.
I feel the pressure now. I feel the pressure.
Yeah. You feel the pressure. We start with Ben. Social media algorithms, he says, are designed to encase users in echo chambers and feed them content that reinforces their own views. And we're all familiar with that. How can we overcome the walls of the echo chamber? And even if we hang out with non-Christians online, doesn't evangelistic content usually just land back in the Christian bubble and never reach those who hold very different views? So, are the algorithms against us, in other words?
Yeah. Was that Ben who asked that? Sorry.
Yeah, that's Ben Chang. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Yeah, brilliant, absolutely brilliant question. And the algorithms are monstrous, aren't they? Because they do keep you in echo chambers. And obviously, as Christians, that can happen to us, that we end up just getting fed things that we agree with. In the old days, I would say 5-6 years ago, I think you could overcome those walls just by creative use of hashtags. There were ways on Facebook. At SOLAS, we used to sort of just post lots of things in different Facebook groups, and it just sort of went out there. I think in recent years, the algorithm's taken over. So there are 2 ways, I think, to overcome those walls. If you are a church or a ministry, you can pay to play, by which I mean by creative use of advertising, Google ads, Facebook ads, by creative use of targeting and keywords and so on. You can actually push content to a degree over those walls and in front of others. So that's one way of doing it, if that's a possibility. The other way you can do it, I think, is you can deliberately go looking for those other tribes, and I mentioned this earlier, and trying to hang out in those spaces. Now, that can be exhausting if you're trying to really wideband broadcast. But I said earlier, if your hobby is rock climbing or you follow a particular football team, whatever, I think there's a great opportunity to jump into those groups. And now it's going to be more organic share there. I don't think you could just go spamming those groups because people may respond with hostility. But as you hang out and take part and engage with people, you're going to get to know people. And just like if you were hanging out at the local soccer club, you can do the same thing online. So there's that way of doing it too. So I think you probably were in a world of either pay to play if you're a ministry and creative use of advertising and so forth, or as I say, actually deliberately going and trying to look for a group quite different to yours. And that, by the way, also happens in return. So I do know that atheists will find, for example, Solas content. They've obviously gone looking for Christians. And that's why I say when somebody posts a comment, no matter how rude it is, I always want to try and be winsome because at least they've come into my echo chamber. But yeah, the algorithms have made life much harder, I accept.
Yeah. Now, pay to play, and in the introduction we mentioned, just how expensive is it? How much kit knowledge do you use to be effective in the digital space? So, just some comments on that, on the costs of it.
The great thing is, Peter, I would say that actually you can scale it. So you can spend absolutely nothing online. You could be just somebody who goes and joins some Facebook groups related to your hobbies. You hang out, you chat with people, you keep an eye out for other good Christian content, and you prayerfully look for ways to connect the two. At the other end of the scale, you can, if you're a church or a ministry, you can equip yourself with a little TV studio and produce amazingly high quality Christian content and do that really, really well. I know people doing that. And then in the middle, you can do that stuff. I'm very good friends with a name of somebody who might be known to some of you on this call because he's quite well known. There's a friend of mine called Michael Otts, who's quite a well-known evangelist in the UK.
Yeah.
And Michael and I we share a lot of hill walking. We were hill walking last week, and he's having huge connection into places like Instagram and TikTok by doing 1-minute videos addressing questions about the Christian faith. I said, Michael, what's your secret? He went, I literally went out, he said, I bought a little gimbal thing for my phone so it stabilizes, it looks good. And I bought a radio microphone. So he said, I spent probably about a couple of $100 on kit, that's all. And he said, then what I've done is I've just been faithful with my time. And in his case, every day, he does a 1-minute video addressing a question, an idea, or whatever. And I post it in faithfully. And he said the first few months it was quite flat, but now it's taken off like a rocket. But I've had to be patient and faithful in engaging there. But now he's seeing huge numbers of people engaging with content. So that was for an outlay of about $200 on just a little bit of kit, so he could do what he was doing well. So I think the answer, Peter, you can do it for free one way, you can do it for a low budget one way, and you can do it for a higher budget another way. And that's not to talk about advertising, by the way. That's just in terms of the kit, in terms of producing things. But don't think that you have to spend vast amounts of money to be an online evangelist.
Great. And I think a lot of us have seen pictures of you and Michael walking the hills on Facebook and so on, or Michael's short videos, often in remote mountain locations, which is...
Yes, he was literally texting. He was texting me this morning, Peter, from the top of a mountain. I told him I was speaking to you guys, and Michael just bombarded me with dental and medical puns that he thought would be helpful for my talk. None of them I've used.
Yeah, sure, but his other content is great quality. So, and
he's very good. He's worth checking out.
You made several references to big questions. You just mentioned them again, and I think we all probably know the big questions, but I'd be very interested to know, of all the content that you've produced at Solas, what are the questions or issues that have really gone viral, if you like? Where do you think that things are that really touch a chord with people? And I mean, atheists or people of other faiths.
Yeah. Well, where we found in recent years, Peter, I talked about the wandering approach. And some of those wandering questions for us, that's why we eventually did the book, took off like a rocket. So, for example, questions around things like human rights and justice, because those are stories always in the news. But we found if you can find ways to explore the question, why do human rights matter? Why do we think human beings have rights and value and dignity, as opposed to just being 1% bit of pollution in the universe, to quote the atheist physicist Lawrence Krauss. We found if you can hook a question into something in the media. So one of the most successful movie ones we ever did, about 2.5 years ago, when the last Bond movie came out, No Time to Die, we wrote a little blog piece called "Is there ever a good time to die?" ? And we hooked it using hashtags and things off the all the buzz online about that Bond movie, and we got thousands of engagements because I think people who were searching for the movie found our piece, and it was done it was quite clever. It started with some sort of Bond references for people who are into that. So I would say either a big question that people are talking about a lot, AI would be another one right now. Lots of people are thinking about that, wrestling about that, or the UK right now where euthanasia is being talked about because of what's being proposed. Real opportunity there, not for us necessarily to jump in on the big issues. Take the euthanasia piece. Some people and some Christian medics, so a very important role in combating that and fighting that. For others of us, raising the question of going, well, are there some gospel issues that you can jump off that big issue for? And I think there's a real wisdom as Christians in knowing and practicing and thinking about how can we preach the gospel through an issue without just getting sidetracked by the issue itself. But it will change depending on what's going on in the news, what's going on. I recognize we've got different countries on the call. But a really interesting exercise is to ask yourself, what is everybody talking about right now? And is there some way I could start from there and link that just gently to some aspect of the gospel?
Yeah. Now, you talked about the culture wars and the emotions and reactions that they generate and how quickly things can, degenerate into mudslinging and so on. There's a question here, anonymous question. There's lots of evidence that dramatic, salacious, angry, hyperbolic content gets far more clicks online than that which is nuanced, subtle, thought through, detailed. Is there an argument for making clickbait style evangelistic content? Or does there come a point where this becomes unethical? And I guess maybe it's a question too about the kind of hooks that we use, because if people aren't going to click on your piece, they're not going to get any benefit at all from your insights. But can you comment on that? When cross the line, what works, what's appropriate?
Yeah. It's a tricky one because on the one hand, I love the question because it's playing into the algorithms and you're absolutely right that the algorithms are designed to kind of maximize and promote content that just gets a reaction. In fact, Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned with his Righteous Mind book, has got a new book out called The Anxious Generation, looking at the impact that social media is having on young minds. And a lot of it is because of that way it front loads through the algorithms, the really extreme stuff. I would caution Christian to be very, 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 very careful in how because I think we can be playing with fire. The temptation to try and get clicks. And I think one of the questions we need to think about is what actually is a click? Are we measuring our ministry success through clicks and eyeballs and likes? Or are we measuring it through actual impact and fruit? And I would far rather have a lower number of people reading or watching something, but actually out of that comes some substantive conversations than getting distracted by go, wow, that was amazing. We did that really controversial video. 1 million people watched it, but actually a week on, I've seen nothing. A couple of thoughts you can do, which perhaps plays in the middle. You can be a bit cheeky if you're wired this way. If you're somebody on this call with a slight sense of humor, there are ways of playing with stuff. If everybody is yelling at each other about something, if you can come up with something that hooks into that but doesn't, actually play the game, so you're not wading into the argument, but you're using the discussion that everyone's going on about. It's hard. I'm trying to think of an example now. My brain's gone foggy, but I have seen people do that quite well, where you've got two sides yelling at each other in a discussion, and as a Christian, you've come in and gone and you've posted something that perhaps on the first look people think you're saying something, and then you click and you see something different. Eugene Peterson, the late Eugene Peterson, talked about telling the gospel slant. How do you come sideways into some of these issues? And so I suspect some of you on this call who are perhaps creatively minded may be thinking, yeah, I could think of ways of doing that. And then thirdly, I just think there's also a role for Christian peacemaking online as well. And quite frankly, if stuff comes across your wall or your feed that's toxic, don't be afraid. You'll get shot at, but don't be afraid to go, is there a better way of saying this that doesn't sort of treat the other person as the worst of all evils? One sign you're doing that well is both sides then start firing at you. But I think there's something actually about trying to be a peacemaker in this world, because I think people are looking at the same time. You're right that there's the algorithms promoting the extreme stuff. I also think people are looking for voices of wisdom and calm as well. And if Christians are seen to be doing that, there's an opportunity. That was a kind of sort of long, slightly rambling answer to a brilliant
Yeah, no,
question. So I hope.
that helpful. Good range of stuff. So it was always said on the internet, don't feed a troll. In other words, if there's someone who really seems to be opinionated and won't change and is very insulting and so on, the best thing is just to ignore them. You talked about how it was important to engage those who
Yeah.
came to our websites who were more hostile, but just some
Yeah.
wisdom about finding the
Yeah.
balance then. Jesus
Yeah,
sometimes
you're
said,
right.
didn't he? And there were other times when he engaged.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter. And I think a good principle is always do at least perhaps one response, if you've got the time. So if someone says something a bit snarky, start by sort of saying, well, thank you, for your comment. I don't entirely agree with you. Perhaps have you considered? And then see if they come back with, sort of letting you have it with both barrels. There can be a time to even then just say, look, we're obviously not going to agree. Thank you for engaging with the piece. Have a lovely day. And then if they come back again, you've got the right to ignore them, I think. But I think it's a good idea to engage at least once. I'm always struck in scripture, right? I think we see this model. I mean, look at someone like the Apostle Paul. What the first Christians must have thought when they saw that guy. Probably lots of people were like, just ignore him. But actually, I'm glad that firstly the Damascus Road, and then he was welcomed in by those who were willing to give him the time of day. And I've got one or two friends from atheist backgrounds who, if you'd met them as a hardcore atheist, were spitting vile and poison and all kinds of things. But somebody took the time. So yes, I think discern. Don't spend all of your time if it's endlessly rude and vitriol, but just have the courage to actually, the first time someone says something, to extend the arm of friendship, because you never know how the Lord will use that.
Yeah, and I like that balance. I guess there is a time for the digital dusting of sandals and not casting pearls before swine, if you like. But at the same time, a
Yeah.
gentle answer can avert wrath and turn into a useful conversation. So
Absolutely. And by the way, it goes without being said, but it needs to be said too. Just be very, very conscious of our own engagement online, because I've made mistakes over the years. It's very easy to feel, your hackles rise and you feel I've got to
yeah,
say something because they've said something. It's always worth praying before you hit send, and trying
sure.
to remind yourself that the person on the other side of the screen is an image bearer made in God's image, even if they're, a nutcase.
Yeah. Question here from Rod McRory. My church depends on Facebook for news and online services, but half our members will not use Facebook. Should we persuade them to join, or should all leave? Or is it horses for courses, I guess?
I think that's a great question. I think it's horses for courses. That's a whole other discussion about the digital disenfranchising of people who aren't online, whether that's Facebook, or there's been sort of studies done showing that the elderly tend to use smartphones less than the young, and we live in a world where it's increasing. If you don't have the technology, there's things you can't do. So I wouldn't be encouraging people actively onto those platforms. Not least, by the way, the reason that if a platform is free, like Facebook, the reason it's free is that you're the product. And one of the mistakes that, in fact, Jonathan Haidt points this out in The Anxious Generation, that one of the mistakes we make around social media is we think we are the customers. You are not Facebook's customer. The advertisers are the customer. We're just the
Yeah.
chickens in the barn, as it were. So yeah, I wouldn't be encouraging people onto those platforms. Which means, as churches, you do probably need to think about multifaceted ways of reaching your congregation, I'm afraid. I was talking to a pastor the other week, actually, who said he's figured out we need about 8 channels of communication now. We have the church WhatsApp group, we have the Facebook page, we have the email, because we do have people using platforms differently. I just think that's the world we live in, I'm afraid.
Yeah, sure. Frank Cantor's saying, I agree that face-to-face encounters over a cup of coffee are better than digital communication, but how do you do this with a global audience, and how do you work out who's in your immediate vicinity? And I guess it's a question too about, how possible is it to build really good relationships online, maybe one-to-one,
Yeah.
through digital encounters, because we
Yeah.
know that most people who come to faith through through hearing the truth in the
Right.
context of a trusted relationship, don't they?
Yeah. Well, yes, they do. Certainly, majority. Although you get some unusual ones. The most unusual one I think I've ever had in my ministry, Pete. We had a pastor of a church in Scotland, reach out to us last year, just to encourage us that someone had walked into his church that Sunday before who'd come to faith at home. And this guy had basically come across Solas, had sat down and watched every single short answer video. They were never intended to be used that way. Got to the end, decided that every question was answered, became a Christian, and then walked into church, his local church the following Sunday and went, "Where do I begin?" Now that's unusual, but it was lovely. So a couple of thoughts there. If they are local, and sometimes you find it out just chatting with people, you could discover, where are you from and whatever. It turns out they are local. I've had situations where I've been able to say, oh gosh, you're just around the corner. Why don't we grab a coffee sometime? That sometimes happens. Secondly, I think if you can connect them, I mentioned this. So I've had situations where people have been really intrigued, and I've been able to say things like, look, there's this wonderful course called Alpha that loads of churches run that helps you explore these things. Would you be interested in me helping you find somewhere locally where you could do that? And I've had the privilege of doing that a few times. And then, by the way, the happy medium on this is a lot of online too. You have those private spaces. So being careful to do this appropriately and, with appropriate wisdom. But I've had, times where I've been having conversations with somebody and I'll have said to them, look, rather than us have this discussion, in the comments section on Facebook, would you mind private messaging me if you're happy? And I'm very happy to continue the conversation, but it'd be great to continue it where there are 1,000 other people jumping in. Sure. So you can create this. And again, just be aware of that. Be careful. There's a few sort of, obviously, in terms of safeguarding, I haven't got time to talk about all of that, but just be aware. Don't do that with young people. I wouldn't do it with someone from a different gender to your own. But it can be really helpful, actually, because again, sometimes people will say one thing when they know the world is watching, and there'll be a deeper relationship where it's just the two of you. So yes, a range of answers there.
Yeah, thanks. Well, sadly, Andy, we've run out of time and I have to draw things to a close now. And then finally, it just remains to me to say thanks so much, Andy, for speaking again, hosting the questions. And we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. May Lord bless you. Thank you.